The preservation of Africa's resources and environment is a key factor if it is to industrialize. Delegates at the 20th African Union Conference of Ministers of Industry also heard that countries that industrialize have higher development. Joining us now from Nairobi to discuss industrialization in Africa is Chief Regional Integration Officer of the African Development Bank, Lamin Mana. Lamin, good evening and thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Karima.
This is Nozipo speaking, and let me first ask you, Lamin, to paint the picture for us in terms of the key agenda items that the Ministers of Industry were tackling today. What were those key issues?
Actually, the ministers will be meeting from Thursday. This was the senior officials meeting, and we're looking at the key issues for industrialization on the continent. What does it take to launch the industrialization agenda? How do we finance it? Who would be the key players? And what are the recommendations to make to governments to fast-track that industrialization agenda?
Lamin, we know that there has been consensus from as early as 2008 that industrialization is key towards development and growth in Africa. Are there any notable strategies that we should be expecting to come out of this conference on how exactly the continent is going to overcome this phase of discussion and really move towards implementable strategies?
That's right. I mean, and that is the key objective, to move to the implementation phase. What we did start with in Algiers last year, March 2012, we looked at a series of projects, pilot industrialization projects submitted by the different regional economic communities on the continent. The 8 which were approved by the AU were requested to submit pilot projects. They submitted those projects, and the ADB is currently working on those projects together with the UNECA and the AU, which is the driving force behind the whole process, and together with the African regional economic communities. So the objective is to come up with projects which will be the pilots for the different regional economic communities that we can implement. So we're looking at finishing that preparation of the projects to a bankable stage by the 3rd quarter of this year, and then we'll start resource mobilization around those projects to start to move to the implementation phase.
Lamin, before we begin to discuss the resources that will be required to get these projects to a bankable state, as you've noted, let's first turn our attention to how exactly these projects are positioned to see a more even balance in Africa's trading terms, especially if one thinks of the example of Africa's trading relationship with China.
Yes, I mean, Africa's trading relation has been deteriorating for some time, and we do believe that one of the best ways of overcoming that difficulty is enhancing the integration of the continent. Integration in terms of the regions and integration of the continent globally. If we can come up with these regional projects which have wider, larger economic spaces integrated, it is easier to attract investors. And if we attract investors to those projects in the regions which are integrated and more or less seamless, it is easier to attract investments into major projects, and that way we can trade within the regions, enhance our regional trade, and trade intra-regional. If we can do that, then globally, then we move from regional trade to inter-regional trade and to global trade. The possibility of enhancing Africa's position on the global market in terms of trade is real, but we have to start by integrating the regions and enhancing the trade and facilitating trade, which requires, of course, developing the infrastructure that will enhance that trade.
Lamin, let's go back to the question of value addition. I understand that you're speaking about regional trade and how African states coming together are a stronger force than trading unilaterally. But if there isn't any degree of beneficiation that is taking place on our raw materials, irrespective of how many of us to come together in a group, surely that wouldn't make a difference. And I think the key issue here that I'm trying to get to is that, are these projects fundamentally going to be focusing on ensuring that there's some degree of beneficiation of raw materials before we begin exporting?
Oh, absolutely. That is the key objective, because we've been trading essentially in raw materials, and the beneficiation is done elsewhere. Now, the objective of the African leaders and the African Development Bank, which is going to be doing the funding, is to move towards beneficiation of those projects, of those raw materials on the continent. So we move from exporting raw materials to processing those raw materials on the continent and trading in finished products or semi-finished products. That's where the beneficiation, yes, sorry.
No, please go ahead. You can complete the thought.
Yes, I was saying that beneficiation is going to bring in additional resources to the continent, enhance the livelihood of the continent's people, and hopefully lift millions of people out of poverty in the next couple of years, because that is the objective, beneficiation to enhance the value of the products.
Taking Africans out of poverty, a very big objective. Lamin, what is the role of the African Development Bank in reaching this target?
The role of the African Development Bank is primarily financing those development projects that will move the African continent closer to that objective of poverty eradication or reduction. It is Africa's premier investment bank, and we are financing as many of those development projects as possible through ADBs' own resources, through concessional resources, or through our market window, and also leveraging additional resources into the continent. If you take, for example, infrastructure development, that is key to developing industries. And we are involved in a very significant way in infrastructure development on the continent, because you will not create industries if you don't have a means of transportation, transporting the produce from the farm to the industries and from the industries to the markets. So we need that transportation sector developing. We need energy. You wouldn't start up a factory if you don't have energy to power the factory. You need ICT, because you need to link those industries to the markets, and without ICT, you are handicapped. So these are some of the areas where we're developing the potential of the continent, investing in infrastructure to ensure that the regions, and particularly at the regional level, to integrate the countries and the regions so as to facilitate trade. And of course, that will be accompanied by other measures which we're working with the states to try to develop, such as facilitating movement across borders, harmonizing some of the regulations and legislation, because you have the hard infrastructure section and then the soft infrastructure in terms of regulations to be able to facilitate the free movement of goods which will be processed, and beneficiation will take place in order to enhance Africa's position, trading within itself and with the outside world.
Lamin, you speak of very bold strategies that would no doubt also require very bold investment. How much exactly is the African Development Bank going to put behind this push towards industrialization?
Currently, that is an issue being discussed, and what we need to do first is look at those projects, develop them to a bankable stage, and then it goes to our board, the African Development Bank, with the proposals for funding. Some of them might be funded directly by the bank. For some, we need to develop maybe partnerships with other donors on the continent and other development partners. But at this stage, it's a bit premature to talk about the exact cost. We know it's going to be a significant amount of money, in hundreds of millions of dollars, I would assume. But we have to work towards developing the projects first to a bankable stage and putting a realistic cost on them. When we do the costing, then we take it to our board of directors. But of course, we're working with the regional economic communities, the African Union Commission, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and other partners. We work together, develop those projects to that stage, take it to our board of directors at the African Development Bank. Once it's approved, then we can move to funding.
Of course, you also speak of partnerships, Lamin, which would be the bedrock of many of these projects that are being tabled. What has been the appetite of the private sector, even in these early stages, to come on board as a credible investment partner?
We are talking already to some people, and I think the African Development Bank's position in terms of its credibility helps a lot. And knowing that the African Development Bank is involved in a project is very good for us to leverage additional resources and talk to other partners. And there is a willingness to invest in projects in Africa, because African projects, particularly in those sectors, are viable projects. Most of the time, the partners are ready to come in. We just need to have good, bankable projects. Once we have that, mobilizing funding is much less of a problem.